Yes.
Okay, so hi everyone, and first of all, welcome to those who were here last week, and welcome to those who were not here last week. The topic of this talk, my name, just for those who don't know, I'm Daniel Rowe. I'm one of the rabbis here. I also have a PhD, well, I don't yet have a PhD in philosophy of matter. Hopefully will do very soon. But what we typically talk about is used to do with science and Torah, or sometimes philosophy and Torah, science and Judaism, philosophy and Judaism. And last week we took a lot of questions, because I wanted to set the topics we're going to discuss. And last week itself we discussed whether there's a logical reason to believe in the existence of God. Like I said, for those who want, you can join my WhatsApp group where these things get posted. Last week's one's not yet been posted, so it will come up hopefully. Is there a WhatsApp group between all of you? Like if one of you gets my thing, you can share. I can share the link, and you can all share. Okay, fine. So hopefully I will let you catch it last week's. There were a few other very big. We dealt with a few small questions as well last week. Small, I mean, just they're not necessarily small questions, but they were able to be dealt with relatively quickly. Whereas I'd said to reserve the question of the age of the universe, how that works with Torah, we're going to save for this week. There was also a question about the divine authorship of Torah, which I want to save for next week, just because we might have time for a few small things at the end of each of these. They're each like at least 40-minute discussions. Maybe somebody more intelligent than me could get them into smaller time periods, but generally speaking, that's how I find it takes to get through them. Okay, so that means that this week, and there were other topics as well, which I think we covered most of last week, but you'll remind me if there's any that I haven't yet dealt with. Okay, so this week's topic, therefore, is the classical science and Torah topic of the age of the universe, plus many other pieces that fit in. And I'll give a few introductory remarks to that title. One is this, in principle, as a general one, which contains the water. Amen. So, in principle, there shouldn't really be a problem between science and Torah, and generally that's true of probably science and religion, in the sense that they are not, generally speaking, overlapping areas of study of human thought. Why? Because science is the window, and by the way, there's so much exciting noise coming there. So, sound-wise, to limit the sound coming. Yeah, they're both good. Okay, fine, perfect. So we're just getting the excitement of lots of Jews learning Torah next door. Fantastic. Science is in its essence a descriptive endeavor. That means to say, its goal is to describe what we see, describe the laws that underlie, using the logic of mathematics, the language of mathematics. I think that's Galileo's observation. The universe is in the language of maths. So we try to come up with the mathematical formulas that best describe and predict the patterns that we see. And the objective of it primarily, I mean, it's definitely an area of interest of its own, but it's primarily so that we can actually do things with it. That's the major reason we really love studying maths, because it gives us technology. Right, we are able to learn about the universe, but we're also able to manipulate the universe and build aircraft and smartphones and AI and all this kind of stuff, because we understand how things work, how metals conduct things, and how various different silicon, how you can do different things with the hardware of the world, and ultimately how you can manipulate the electromagnetic radiation going around, and ultimately we can keep developing things. But science is therefore a descriptive project. Torah, like other religious and ethical areas, is primarily a prescriptive project. That is to say, it's not trying to tell you so much what there is, it's trying to tell you what it's here for, and what therefore we should do, how therefore we should live our lives. So the goal of Torah is, no matter what level of scientific knowledge you have, here's the things you should do in different situations, here's the things you shouldn't do in different situations. And therefore, in principle, one ought to be able to say that in the meta picture, they are non-overlapping projects. That's a bit too simplistic for a variety of reasons, but that's important to keep in the background, because even if they appear to be talking about the same things, the goal of the conversation may shape the language it's in. Okay? So therefore, since the goal of science is always to give us a way of describing the world, and the goal of Torah is always to give us a sense of its purpose, right, wrong, and so on, in principle, should be minimal overlap. However, there is overlap, and the primary overlap is in areas to do with creation, because the Torah gives us a creation story and science gives us a creation story, and they sound at times actually very harmonious and at times very disharmonious. Okay, and the examples last week, the primary example was the age of the universe. Right? I think there were others as well, perhaps about evolution, perhaps about where humanity begins, perhaps these sorts of questions as well within that structure. Okay. Now, just to concretize a little bit about the age of the universe, so we have a standard calendar, Jewish people have a calendar. There's at least a lot of it's worked through the Torah and Tanakh, the biblical text itself. Right, the first 3,000 years more or less ago, really Tanakh ends about 2,500 years ago. Okay, maybe a little bit more further back, but not that much further back, during which we're in the historical era already, where we have enough documentation that we can pretty much map history from there to now. And our calendar, if you work it out using the biblical dates and timelines, appears to be, and we actually have this exact calendar, about 5,785, about to be 86 years old. Okay, so that is problematic because that takes us right back to the very beginning, the first man, the beginning of the universe, and modern paleontology and whatever will tell us that humans alone are hundreds of thousands of years old. Modern geology will tell us planet Earth is about 4 billion years old. Modern cosmology will tell us the universe in the standard model at the moment is about 13.8 billion years old. That could be adjusted, but it's certainly, no matter how far it's adjusted, it's going to be a lot more than 6,000 years. It's not like it's about to be revised down to 6,000 years ago. So, and that's true of lots of things. Dendrochronology, right? The study of trees and tree rings gives us chains that are 10,000 years old. Wherever you look, you're looking at models that certainly predate the Torah's 6,000 years. That's the classical standard problem. Now, before I go into answers and approaches, I'm not going to give you one. I'll survey a set of approaches. There's one I have particular preference for, which I'll probably spend a lot of time on, but I'll survey 4 probably major approaches that are the most, I would say of them all, 3 of them, the ones I'm going to spend, 3 of them are the most common. One of them is actually the most common in Jewish sources, but not necessarily the most spoken of. But I want to just hear what approaches you may have heard so far. So, yeah.
I think it's Gerald Schroeder has a...
I will talk about Gerald Schroeder's approach briefly.
Okay.
He's got a very interesting approach. Yeah.
I mean, the idea that because the sun and the moon were created at a certain point, that could account for however many years.
So I think the approach you're trying to tap into is the days of creation are not necessarily days the way we see them.
Correct.
Okay, good. That'll be roughly the 3rd approach we'll look at. Schroeder's will be the 4th. Okay, although that will be an important insight into others. Okay, we'll elaborate and talk about that. Good. What else? What other approaches might people have heard of? So I'm going to talk about 4 approaches, and we'll deal primarily with the age of the universe, but we'll also start to see how other topics will make their way into that discussion. Yeah.
There's also, I heard one that the world was made old already.
World was made old already. Okay, we'll touch upon that. Will actually be the first one I'll just touch upon. I won't spend long on it, but that is important to state because many people, certainly in the Orthodox Jewish world, will go for that, right? Okay, fine. So we've touched in this audience about approaches 1, 3, and 4, which I will talk about. Approach number 2 we haven't yet touched upon, which is the one that's less commonly spoken about, but I think in many ways the most important and most authentic to Jewish sources. But we'll touch all 4 of them. Okay, so let's briefly deal with the first. The first approach is, again, one that you will not hear a lot in people who are more, let's say, skeptical of Judaism and scientifically minded, but it's one that's relatively prevalent in large parts of Orthodox circles, although it's not as spoken of as you might expect, certainly in the Haredi world, maybe in the modern Orthodox world a bit more. But some people will say, well, look, God could have made a universe look older than it really is. What do I mean by that? Let's make that a little bit less ad hoc, although, yeah, go on.
Are you referring to, I've heard people, when they explain why it appears that, when you dig into their score, they say it's because when God flooded the earth, because of all the pressure, it made it appear as if it was that old?
Yeah, okay, so it's very important. These questions, let me take a step back then. These questions have been around since at least the 19th century, okay? During that time, there was already a lot of early scientific work going on, so there was already an awareness that people had found fossils of animals that looked to be very different to any that exist in the world today. People had found beginning of evidence that things looked a lot older than they are today. And so some hypotheses were thinking events like creation events, like the flood could have altered the shape of things. Maybe some of these species were wiped out in the flood. But today we have a lot more scientific information, and those sorts of approaches and answers don't work as well. Okay? they require, generally speaking, quite radical reinterpretations of a lot more science than just pressure. So it's fair to raise that point. Okay, so I'm going to get into these four. Before I do, I'm going to give another one or two introductions here, which is that there is a meta-narrative out there in the world that says the more science advances, the more it diverges from the biblical picture. That's not actually a completely accurate picture at all. Okay, there's areas where it's true, but there's areas where it's actually not true. And I'll give you an interesting example, since you reminded me of 19th century, we'll turn to the beginning of the 20th century. Let's suppose you took the year 1900, and you surveyed physicists in 1900, and asked them how old the universe is. Okay? Do you know what the majority answer would have been? Last week I explained why philosophically the structure of matter is actually impossible, but for a variety of reasons, most physicists in the beginning of the 20th century, actually all the way through till the 1950s, funnily enough, believed in a kind of steady state model of the universe, where the universe kind of had always been there. There's very deep philosophical problems with that, mathematical problems, but it was the standard belief. I think Scientific American took a survey of physicists, I think in the 1950s, I forget, you can look this up, and still found the majority still believed in a steady state model of the universe. Been around forever. Against them, the second most prevalent view was a biblically inspired view that around 6,000 years ago, God made a special creation. He created heaven, he created earth, and he put various objects and entities into it. There was a third view that was almost unheard of, and it's a kind of traditional Jewish view that is expressed in the second most prominent commentary on the Torah, right? Who's the most prominent commentator on the Torah text? Rashi, right? Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki lives around the turn of the millennium, the 11th century, and his commentary is the most studied, it's the most standardly printed. But the second most studied, which is quite a long way down, because lots more people read Rashi than anything else, is Nachmanides, the Ramban. And that, in some ways, has extra levels of authority over Rashi in the sense that he brings many more sources in. It's a much more complex, much longer commentary. Doesn't comment on as much quantitatively, but goes into much more qualitative discussion. And amongst the other kind of additions he brings in is what he calls the Derech HaEmes, the way of truth, which is Kabbalah, basically, or we nowadays call Kabbalah. And he writes about it in very cryptic ways. He deliberately doesn't want it to be revealed to audiences that don't have some understanding of it, but those who do, he wants to show them how the ideas cohere with Torah. And in his introduction to the Torah, and also in his commentary on the beginning of Genesis, he makes the following observation, partly based on tradition and partly based on the words used in the creation chapter. And what he says is that the verb for creation from something from nothing, bara, is a very rare verb in the creation chapter. Most verbs, asiyah, yetzirah, Hebrew verbs, are the creation of something from that which already exists. And Nachmanides records this tradition that he thinks best interprets the verbs chosen, that there was only one creation of something from nothing, and the entire universe at its beginning was contained in what he calls an akuda achas ketana, a tiny little dot. And elsewhere he quantifies that dot was smaller than a seed of mustard, which was the smallest measuring unit anybody could conceive of in those days. So much smaller than any measurable unit was the universe. And at one point he describes it as dak ma'od ein bo mamash, so thin that it lacks substance. And out of that universe's, I guess, expansion, right, must have got a lot bigger, come all the things that are within us today. Now, interestingly enough, if we fast forward a few years after the year 1900, so we've got these three hypotheses. Number one, the universe has been around forever in a more or less unchanged state. Number two, there was a special set of acts of creation. Number three, the universe started from a tiny little dot and expanded outwards to produce everything in it, and that dot was so thin it lacked substance. Today, the most prevalent model of the universe's beginning is the Big Bang. It's not the only model out there, but almost every model out there does begin with the universe in a tiny, minuscule state, smaller than a seed of mustard, that expanded to produce everything that's in it today. Okay? The Big Bang literally hypothesizes, if you took it very literally, a point particle, right, smaller than any physical size, rich energy, and then expands outwards and produces everything. But okay, we wouldn't use the word particle actually about the whole universe. But one way or another, whether that's literal, not literal, the whole universe. So the whole universe being contained in a size smaller than a grain of mustard and expanding, which is what we have today, is standard physics. Again, it's not the final verdict, but it's certainly an interesting shift. That if you take the debates around the 20th century, it seems much more aligned with the natural reading of the biblical text together with its classical commentary than it did back then. So it's not true that we always move in a direction of divergence. Sometimes we're moving in a very strong convergence. And there's other examples. But our topic today is the divergence, the age of the universe, right? And other associated questions. So, I said we're going to talk about 4 different approaches. Approach number 1, which we've just begun to sketch, is the idea that God could have made the universe look older than it is. Let me add a little bit more meat onto the bones of that one. I'm not going to spend very long on it, but for I think relatively obvious reasons, but let's just make it a little bit sharper than it might sound. And the point is this: science actually has no way of accessing what the past was directly. Nobody can go back in a time machine and be there. We haven't gone back in a time machine 10,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, 1,000,000,000 years ago, etc. What we can do is look at what we have here today, and given our laws, what is the best extrapolation back into the past? Okay, that's the correct way to do science. That is a very effective way. But if you imagine just like a virtual world created now by any scientist, if you go into it and look at it, it does look like it's older than a few days from the day it's released, right? Right? In other words, that it's not impossible at all that God creates us in this universe, and if you study it, it looks older. It's got a story, it's got a backstory. Theologically, you'd have an interesting set of questions with that. Why? I get why God might make Adam in the Garden of Eden a 30-year-old man rather than a baby, and why trees, if you cut them, might have rings. So I get some backstory, but why do you need one that's at least 14 billion years old? Why do you need one that 99% of species that you ever find in the fossil record don't exist today, etc.? So there'd be questions to answer. Right? You don't want to understand why there's this long story, but it's not an impossible resolution that the universe happens to be as old as Torah says it is, and it looks as old as science says it is. Okay, that's option number 1. You can't really disprove that one. A lot of people won't find that satisfying. Some people will. That's option 1. Option number 2 has some similarities, but is significantly different, and it's perhaps a little more rooted in classical Jewish sources. And it's the options 2, 3, and 4 all start with the following observation: that our calendar does not include the 6 days of creation, okay, or the 7, right? It doesn't include that. Why? How do we know that? Because every year our new year begins on Rosh Hashanah. Right, it's coming up in a few weeks' time, 2.5 weeks' time. So Rosh Hashanah. Now, what does Rosh Hashanah commemorate? So some people think it commemorates the day of creation by tradition, but in fact, it commemorates the day of man is created, and ultimately really ejected from the Garden of Eden. So that means that the first few days of creation are not in our calendar. Now, okay, so what? It's still only a few days extra, right? So no, that could be very significant. And I'm going to give you different models of how that could be significant. Answers 2, 3, and 4 all play on that distinction. Approach number 2 really says the following: that the days of creation are not in our calendar because they are not even discussing the world that we experience. How do we know this? Because after the 6 days of creation, the 7th day are completed, the Torah then zooms into a world called the Garden of Eden. And then man is expelled from the Garden of Eden and eventually leaves a place called Kedem and so on. But here's what's interesting. And here I'm drawing on classical Jewish commentary, not modern post-scientific, which you could accuse of being just apologist and trying to make sense of something post-discovery. I'm talking earlier than that. There's a long tradition that the Garden of Eden is not a physical place. You should know that in the medieval commentators, there's a debate and a discussion: is the Garden of Eden the higher world? Is it in our world? The Torah seems to locate it via 4 rivers that come out of Eden. One of the problems with that is that on Earth, these 4 rivers don't seem to meet. Some want to say maybe there was a time in the past where there were 4 rivers that meet. So there's a debate about this, right? And Nachmanides, who I quoted before, concludes there's a higher Garden of Eden and a lower Garden of Eden. However, Reb Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who I think I've quoted him before, the famous 17th century philosopher of Kabbalah, has a very important piece, which is really drawing from earlier sources, in the work in actually a few works, but particularly in a work called the Das Tivunus, the knowing part. That wasn't the name he gave for it, it's the name the modern printers are giving it. But he writes in there explicitly that the Garden of Eden, even what we call the lower or physical Garden of Eden, is not what you would experience if you went back in space and time. What we talk about is soul and a body, right? The soul is something, the closer to God part of us, the more open to godly revelation part of us, and the body we talk about is the more dense, physical, biological, less obviously connected to God part of us. Is there suppose the gap between soul and body? Really, all of creation has soul, by the way. I think I mentioned this last week, because we think of God as the thinker, thinking the universe into existence, and the gap between the thinker, God, and the thought is called its soul. Okay? I'm not going to re-elaborate on that, and the different levels of the soul, different levels of revelation of God, till it reaches our kind of crusty outer layer, as some people describe it. But the point is that if there's a gap between what we call soul and what we call body, there's a soul to that level too, and a soul to that level too, okay? And what we call soul and body is true of our level, but what the Garden of Eden calls a body is what we call a soul. And what the Garden of Eden calls a soul is a level even deeper than that. Okay, that's an old Jewish tradition. And because man sins, he moves down, so now the soul becomes what was a body before, and there's now a new body, a new vessel to house that. Our job is to get back to Garden of Eden consciousness, where what we call our soul becomes like the body of the next level. And in that world, there was a choice to go down or to go up. And our goal is to actually go up in one level even higher, where the soul of man was actually meant to be the body of the next level. Okay, leave the metaphysics of this aside. In the text, you can see this. How do we know? Because man is described as getting kosnos are garments of skin, flesh, only when he's about to leave the Garden of Eden. So you could say that means like leather clothing. But the literal meaning is, in the Garden of Eden, they did not have the protoplasmic flesh that we have. It was not a physical world in the way we experience physical things. It is like, and again, maybe, I did say actually last week, when we'll have a whole special week talking about the Garden of Eden, because it's central to many issues in science and Torah. Maybe we'll get there if we have time. It's also relevant to Rosh Hashanah, because on Rosh Hashanah we commemorate the 2 days that man lived in the Garden of Eden. Okay, I'm not going to I'm sorry, Torah is so interconnected, you sometimes drop points in that really need elaboration. Okay, let's get back to our point. Let me try to explain therefore what's going on. So the Garden of Eden is not, according to this, a place you'll find if you go back in a time machine. It doesn't live inside space and time. It is, if you like, all of space and time from a completely different perspective. In fact, that's literally captured in the words Eden. Because what does the word Eden mean? This is the Garden of Eden. What is the word Eden? So in biblical Hebrew, Eden has two different meanings. One is pleasure, that's kind of a late secondary meaning, partly derived from the Garden of Eden. But the primary meaning of the Hebrew root ayin, dalet, nun, Eden, is time. What's the modern Hebrew word for time? Do any of you know? Zaman. That word never appears in Torah. It does appear in some biblical texts later on, like the book of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, which, by the way, if anyone interested, I'm talking about later on today at 5:30. That's a little shameless plug in case you're interested. But that word has the word Zaman, that text. The Torah never uses the word Zaman. Almost every temporal word is rooted in the words ayin dalet or ayin dalet nun, Eden. So, for example, it's actually preserved even in modern Hebrew in words like adenu, adayan. These are all time words. So the Garden of Eden is really the garden of time. And that is interesting because what is a garden? A garden in every culture, when I say every culture and civilization, that's a bit of a sweeping generalization since I don't know much about Mongolian culture and civilization and lots of languages and cultures in the world. I'm guessing, certainly based on English language of what I know of Western languages and Middle Eastern languages, which may not be extensive enough, but I think the garden generally means, like it does in English, an arena where you create an environment. So a zoological garden, which we call a zoo for short, is where you gather zoology, you gather animals. A botanical garden is where you gather botany and plants. A garden of time is where you gather all of time. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into what that means, but it seems that means that Adam can traverse time like we traverse space, or experiences time, like almost like a different dimension of order of existence and reality. Those who are very interested in physics might think about B-theory model of time. I'm not going to go into that now. The point is this: the Garden of Eden, in the literal reading of the text, this is not a metaphor. This is literally, what does Eden mean? What does a garden with the skin mean? Even the word Adam means in Hebrew precisely what it is a model Hebrew, humanity, mankind. So there's a soul created in that garden that has a level, soul and body relative to where it is, that is humanity as one, that is divided into male and female in the garden of time, whose job is to come back together and come back to God. And what this means for what we need is the Garden of Eden is not inside space and inside time, it is all of space and time from a completely different perspective, a higher perspective. Or, if you like, it is the room, or even womb, out of which our current state of reality emerges, our lower state of reality. Now, these are very esoteric words. Let me try and give an analogy that is not identical to this, but is close to it. Okay, close enough that it's relevant for us. Suppose I'm sure this will happen, in the not very distant future, you can have a bunch of AI programmers and physicists sitting in a room, and they're going to run a simulated universe from Big Bang to today, something like our universe. And they may want to experiment with what are the minimal parameters you need to generate a world like ours, a universe that has intelligent life in it, and so on. So you imagine in the beginning they run a kind of Big Bang, and all the universe they simulate don't really produce very much, because the statistical probability, at least given our current laws of physics, is vanishingly impossible to produce anything, even organized life, even matter and antimatter even gravitational level being relevant enough that it can cluster things together without collapsing on itself. Okay. But let's suppose by the second day they start fine-tuning its constants and we're able to get a universe like our own, or they have a deeper set of laws they discover. They're able to produce universes with enough clustering that you can produce stars while still holding a spatially expanded universe. And let's suppose after a few days of tweaking, you start to get planets, and you start to eventually get planets with all the right parameters for intelligent life. It might not be our life, it might not even be carbon-based life, it might be something more imaginative, but it's some kind of life. And then eventually, after a bit more tuning and playing with this, you can rerun the whole thing and get life intelligent enough to develop civilizations that we could in principle interact with. And maybe they're intelligent enough to understand the English language, or we can understand their language. And after a few days, let's say a week of running this model, we feel it's the right time to send somebody into this world. And let's say we pick one of you, you're one of those scientists, and you put on the 3D sensory suit, and you're inside their world. And you appear and you start walking around, and you navigate, and you meet somebody, and you start communicating with them. And you say to them, hello, and you introduce yourself, and they introduce themselves. And you give your name, they give their name, and you ask the question, how old are you? But they ask that to you, you give your answer, you ask them, and the person you're talking to turns out to be a very similar age to you, and you get very confused by that. You say, 1 second, you can't be my age, because this universe didn't exist when I was born, right? It's not possible, this universe is only a few days old. And they turn to you and say, what are you talking about? This universe is not only do I have memories of the first however many decades of my life, but I can introduce you to my parents and my grandparents, and I can tell you all about our history, and I can show you the records of past civilizations. And in fact, I can show you the science of our universe is billions of years old. And you say, what are you talking about? It's 5 to 6 days old. Who's right?
Both.
You're both right. From inside the universe, it is billions of years old. From the creation dimension in which it was constructed, it's only a matter of a few days old. And then whatever time you have moving in. So if you now enter this world and then spend another 6,000 years of generations, and you tell people that it's several days of creation old and then this many thousands of years, and other people looking inside their universe back say it's billions of years old, you'll both be right. It just depends which place you're describing. The laboratory in which it was out of which it was emerged and created, or its own structure of time inside. And once you realize that the Jewish tradition has this idea that the days of creation are not inside the universe, but a framework out of which the universe emerged, a higher Kabbalistic world, a higher world in Kabbalistic language. You don't need Kabbalistic language for that in the literal description. You've got the 6 days of creation, Garden of Eden, and then our state of the world. And then you realize that this question of billions of years old from inside the universe, or days of creation, and they're measuring 6,000 years inside the universe. Days of creation outside the universe, 6 days inside, are not contradictions. They're just two different perspectives. But what we do need to ask on this question, so in other words, billions of years, an entire structure of evolution, all these things can be correct. Welcome those guys who walked in. We're in the middle of a discussion of science and Torah, okay? I'm going through 4 different approaches. We're deep in the second approach now, which is that if you read the Torah literally according to the that's it. The exciting build-up, right? You read it literally according to a lot of Jewish traditional sources. The days of creation are not inside our universe, but almost like a laboratory perspective of the dimension out of which our universe emerged. I'm sorry, that's a bit like computer programmers who would build a universe over a few days, but if you go inside that universe, it's billions of years old, okay? So, now, what that would mean is that all the things science talks about are not contradiction to the structure created. The 6 days are like the program. The Garden of Eden is a kind of arena out of which man emerges. And then what would happen is that when man leaves the Garden of Eden, the soul of mankind leaves and spreads all across human civilization. Some very important part of it has to enter the world 6,000 years ago, and there may even have been an individual character who has enough of it that we call that person Adam in the physical world. But something shifts in the consciousness of humanity. Something significant happens 5,780 years ago that we then begin our post-Adam calendar from that. Okay? I'm not going to get too deep into this, but the same Ramchal actually says the full convergence only really happens at the time of Abraham. So there's still kind of layers and shifting and things like that. We're still in between the programmatic world and our world, even as late as Abraham. But at some point, there's a shift out of the Garden of Eden, there's a shift in consciousness, and we take our calendar 5,780 or so years from there. Okay? Now, what's interesting in the archaeological record, I don't know if this is the correct interpretation, is there is a story of Homo hominids. By the way, there are even commentaries on the Torah. Again, they didn't have modern science, so they won't exactly match up, but there are even commentaries on the Torah who say, I think Sepharno is one, that before God put the soul into Adam, there were Adam-like beings walking around even in those 6 days of creation, which means the idea there might have been hominids who had some degree of soul, because every animal does, but not enough to be what we call Adam. And it's only about 6,000 years ago that we get enough, that we now have this potential for a type of relationship with the abstract creator of the universe and that kind of stuff. That seems to be very coherent with what the Torah is talking about. Okay? Now, it is interesting that in the standard model of our archaeology at the moment, although we have to be always tentative, things can shift quite quickly, we do see that early, what we call humans, it depends on when we call a human being, is it 70,000 years ago? That's one definition of a high level of culture. Homo sapien might be 200,000. There's different possible points depending on how you define a human, a modern human. But humans begin with farming to agglomerate populations. That is before wheat is domesticated. And there's that very famous line of Yuval Noah Harari, wheat domesticated us. It's cute, and it has some truth to it, but really, in many ways, it shifted what humans are, because it allowed humans to be still, to sit in one place and not have to move around like nomadic peoples, and also it allowed population explosion to take place. It is true that the population then exploded to beyond the limit point of what we could sustain, and that came with a lot of crisis. But the ability of the human population to explode came from being able to create these wheat things. And humans began to agglomerate big populations. And that happens about 10,000 years ago in the record, and then those populations collapse. I think around 8,000 years ago. Shat al-Hayuk, there may be one being discovered on Turkey even a bit older than that, Jericho. But these populations seem to be very egalitarian, which means they were not well organized for large populations, right? They were not able to, you can imagine why they fell apart, because humans can't all just live together without strong stratification and social complexity and so on. They then re-emerge about 5,500 years ago in a new thing that we call civilization. And civilization has social complexity. It has hierarchies, people who are in charge. It also has certain sophistication, like language, written language starts to appear around this time. And it appears in this part of the world, from Mesopotamia to Egypt. So that could work with the Torah's like 200, 300 years after what we call Adam state consciousness. You're suddenly developing civilization and so on. So, and the Torah story therefore is the pre and beginning of what we call today, in the archaeological language, at least when I last studied it about 15 years ago, civilization. Okay, that's the story of the Torah. So on the second model, there's no contradiction between what the Torah is describing, even in its creation story, and what science is describing. Now, why would the Torah be interested in the kind of womb of creation or room of creation, that depends if you get it with the W-O-M-B or R-O-O-M, or higher dimension from which creation emerges? And the answer goes back to the primary project of the Torah. The Torah's project is to give you the information you need to know why the universe is here, from a moral God's eye perspective, so to speak, and what you're meant to do with it. And anything in the creation chapter will be giving you the programmatic information more relevant to have moral lessons. So why is light and dark separated? What is the meaning of that? Right? What does that imply? What are its implications in our world? That the universe goes through phases of confusion and order, right? Why is that important to know? All those pieces of information about the kind of program that underlies creation will be relevant to give us perspectives that help us make the right decisions now. The technical details of inside our universe billions of years is not that relevant for us to make the decisions the Torah wants us to make. And therefore the Torah will focus on days of creation structure, and then where civilization, where man leaves the state of the garden. The sin of the Garden of Eden will be really critical because it impacts all of us at every moment. Everything that happened in the Garden of Eden is happening within our consciousness all the time. So that's really important to know. And again, hopefully one day we'll talk about that. And then the story of man since 5,785 years ago. Those are the important pieces of information. And on that basis, science and Torah don't contradict at all. Okay, those are the first two approaches. As you see, I spent a lot of time on the second approach, largely because I don't see a lot of literature to discuss it, but also because I think it's so authentically within the Torah sources that it's true whether or not some of the others are true as well. They may also be true, but they're different. Approaches 3 and 4 are approaches given by people you might term reconciliationists. And they want to take a different approach. They want to say, even if you try to see the Torah as describing our universe, not the higher realm, inside our universe, it still lines up with science. How can that be? So there's a few famous advocates of this view. One is a person called Natan Aviezer, who was a physicist in Bar Ilan University, and also, for those from England, Leeds University at some point. Okay, and then and he wrote a series of books in, I think, the 1990s, maybe early 2000s. I don't know what his status is now. But he wrote a series of books and did some lecturing and so on. And he is a very interesting person, and he articulated a view that others articulate. And he first observed that basically the structure of the days of creation, the pattern and the order, seems to be very consonant with the order that science gives us, with one exception, right? So light and dark separating, what we call in modern physics, the decoupling of light is a very early event in the universe, first day of creation, right? And the emergence of the planet Earth, and then being in some kind of watery state, and the shift in the atmosphere, and then the emergence of dry land, and plant life coming immediately with all that, and then life evolving in the sea, and then flying organisms coming after that, and then terrestrial animals, and then man. All is exactly correct. And he's actually very impressed with that, because if human authors writing the Torah, it would not have been an obvious necessarily order to put things in. You could debate that point. However, the one big exception that seems to be wrong is that according to the Torah's account, the sun, moon, and stars only appear on the 4th day of creation. But according to the cosmological account, they have to appear before planet Earth, actually right there. After decoupling of light, before Earth is there, you need them. But Aviezer points out that the Talmud tells us, an oral tradition, that in fact the sun and everything else was there on the first day. It just something changed on the fourth day to make it visible. Now the question is, what is that? So the natural reading of the Talmud is there in some kind of potential state, but is brought into its actual state maybe on the fourth day, or perhaps it was moved into position. But it's a perfectly coherent reading of the Talmud to say it was visible on earth and it became visible on the fourth day, for which there would be very good scientific reasons. The nature of the early atmosphere in the universe would have been such that you would not have been able to see through it. So you'd have known there was light and dark, but you wouldn't have known there was a sun and moon until eventually, after enough photosynthesis, it changes, becomes transparent, and you can see the sun, moon, and stars exactly after plant life emerges, i.e. exactly where the Torah says. So he's very impressed with I said earlier, Nachmanides' idea of the kind of Big Bang model being already there in the Jewish tradition, B, the days of creation lining up. The problem is the age, and here he makes the following point. Returning to what I said earlier, our calendar is 5,718, 6 years, plus the days of creation. And he says, 1 second, why do you call them days of creation? Because the Hebrew word says each one is a yom, yud vav mem, and you translate yom as day. But interestingly enough, in Hebrew, unlike in English the word day is very unambiguous. It can only mean a 24-hour period, night and day, or day and night. Right? Today we call it the rotation of the earth. But in Hebrew, the word yom is much more ambiguous. It doesn't just mean day. Do you know what else it means? Year. We also have the word shana. But yamim plural means years very often in Torah. When it talks about calculating years, it talks about calculating yamim. That's the plural of yom, of days. So it's days, but it's also years. It's sometimes used for a jubilee cycle, a 50-year period. It's even in one place in Psalms used for a millennium. Ki elef shanim beinecha ki yom esma, right? 1,000 years in your eyes is a yom, the day before. So it's yom, it seems to be a generic word for cycles of time. It's not linked to a specific one. It is true that the most frequent cycle of time we experience is a day, and therefore the most frequent use of the word yom is a day. But the literal meaning of yom is a cycle of time, and you need a context to work out what it means. So when we say it is day one, in Hebrew it doesn't say day one, it is cycle of time one. Cycle of time, the second cycle of time, the third cycle of time, the fourth cycle of time. So nothing in the text itself tells us that it must be 24 hours. Now there is a reason we might indicate it's 24 hours, because just before then each day says Vayki Erev, Vayki Voker, which literally means it was evening and it was morning, cycle of time one. Well, that cycle of time is obviously a day, right? But, says Aviez, I think, that's not quite correct, because what does the Hebrew word Erev literally mean? It doesn't literally mean evening. Evening is one of its many meanings. It literally means chaos or confusion or fusion. For example, the same Hebrew word Erev refers to Eruv. Any mixture is called that word. Anytime you mix things together, it becomes Erev, Eruv. A classical example is actually on Shabbat. If you want to take all the private domains and mix them into one, you have to first mark out the area, and it's called Eruv. And we literally call the markation an Eruv, but technically that's not what it is. The Eruv is the mixture. You have to then legally go and turn all the properties into that one domain, and there's a procedure you need to do. That's Eruv, the mixture. A mixed multitude of people is called an Eruv, Rav in the Torah. So Eruv means fusion, confusion, chaos, or mixture. And the reason we use it for the evening is because as the sun is setting, things become more confused, more mixed up, and jumbled into one. So it literally means it's chaos. And the word for morning, boker, is clarity. It was chaos and it was order, one cycle of time. Now it's natural to translate that through what words can mean, evening and morning, day one. But its literal meaning is chaos and order, one cycle of time. Chaos and order, a second cycle of time. Chaos and order, a third cycle of time. Now, before modern science, there would have been no reason for a person not to call it evening and morning, day one. But given modern science, we translate the exact same words literally as to just say chaos and order, one cycle of time. And Maimonides already told us this in the Guide for the Perplexed, that the creation chapter is full of mysteries. It's primarily for moral teachings. And if science contradicts it, because some scientists of his time thought of the universe being eternal, and forget the arguments you said yesterday. He said if they could somehow prove it, which he said they can't, but if they could, there's no problem reinterpreting the creation chapter as long as you take all the words literally. because Hebrew words often have more than one meaning. And as long as you can make it consistent with the meanings, that's fine. In other words, the Torah is not primarily a book of science. And therefore, the creation chapter, besides God, if you like, speaks in two voices: the moral voice of Torah, of what you might do, and the scientific voice of the book of nature, which you study and discover. And if they appear to contradict, if there's an easy reading that puts them together, you go with that reading. So on that basis, Aviezer wants to say that's a very simple way of reconciling it, and therefore the map that the creation chapter has inside our modern cosmology seems so accurate that all the exact periods of time is not relevant to the Torah. What's relevant is the cycles. Big events happen, moral lessons you can learn from them, and so on. So he wants to say the Torah can even be talking about space-time and still be accurate. The fourth approach, which I hope I would have more time for and I have to just sketch it, is Gerald Schroeder, who you quoted earlier. He is uncomfortable with Aviezer's approach. And the reason he's uncomfortable, he agrees with the basic principle, the 6 days of creation are not in our calendar. He agrees with the mapping into our stages of creation. He agrees that the fourth day means God revealed the sun and moon. He agrees all these various things. But he doesn't like saying the idea Yom is not 24 hours. Why? He agrees it could be read that way. But he likes Nachmanides. And Nachmanides is the one who taught us that the universe began from this tiny infinitesimal, like smaller than a seed of mustard speck and grew out. And Nachmanides also has other insights that from tradition that appear to be very coherent with modern science. And so Schroeder really trusts Nachmanides is Rav Moshe ben Nachman, his tradition. And Nachmanides records a tradition that the days are actual 24-hour periods. Now, by the way, Aviezer has an argument against it being 24 hours. Says whether the sun is created on the fourth day or whether it's revealed on the fourth day, you couldn't have told what a day was until it's fully revealed. Okay. Schroeder said, I do want to work with the 24-hour tradition. But I have another clue that comes from a series of commentators, including Nachmanides, about there's a shift in the language of the days of creation. On the first day of creation, it says it was evening and morning, or chaos and order, day one. So you would then expect it to say it was chaos and order, or evening and morning, day two, or day three. But instead it says Yom Sheni, a second day. And the third day, and the fourth day, a fifth, the sixth, the seventh. So which is the odd one out? First, right? And Schroeder makes this point. When do you call something a first? Usually if you expect that to be a second, or if you've experienced a second. When did the First World War become called the First World War? Only after the second. Before then it was the Great War. There's only one war, right? So he says really, it's like looking at the universe from the beginning, looking forward. It's like there's a camera at the beginning of the universe, noticing day one. There's only one cycle of time, one day. Then it sees another card. Now it's the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. The Torah wants to record that camera angle, and it's like kind of a universal perspective from the beginning looking forward. And only when man is created do we zoom very tightly around man. Now, okay, that might have theological significance. I'm not going to go into that now. But it also has a significance for modern science. Because the same modern science that produced the problem of the age of the universe to Einstein's discoveries and therefore a modeling of how the universe is, also taught us, the same science more or less, the theory of the relativity of time. That depending on where your camera angle is, time will be recorded very differently. Okay, there is no one flow of time in the universe. You could be somewhere right now, as we've been nearly an hour. If they were looking at us, they would have seen us, they would have recorded the whole talk of being only 20 minutes long. Very, very fast. They would hear us all in fast motion. If they're watching us, we're not talking at high speed, right? Everything's at high speed. Our hearts are beating at double the speed, right? They're recording a minute and right, they see 3 of our minutes going past. Other people in the universe, if they had to tell you how long this talk's been going, it would be 1,000,000 years. Every word you're saying is just incredibly slow, right? There's no one flow of time in the universe. And Schroeder says he wants to argue that modern science can kind of simulate the conditions at which he begins the Bible, thinks the Bible began, which is the moment time began, which is the moment matter began, right? Which is currently called in science 10 to the minus fifth of a second after the Big Bang. Big Bang is this incredible explosion of energy that say the universe is in an energetic state. It's way too hot for protons or even for protons to form or neutrons, the basic lots of matter, and therefore for anything to actually clock time. What we call 10 to the minus fifth of a second is the moment at which the universe cools to a level at which time can begin. And we know that that universe is much, much, much hotter than our current universe, which means all the things we see in the background of our universe, microwave background of our universe, were much, much, much more intense, much higher frequency. And since we measure the time of the past of the universe, we always call it a cosmic clock, this microwave background, which means when we look out into the universe and want to see an event from millions of years ago, a supernova, some stuff, right? We are basically looking back through this stretched universe. So if we want to look back with our telescopes and see, we're looking through these stretchy waves, whereas if you look at the beginning, they were much tighter together. And if you kind of see each of these waves almost like a clock, we know, says Schroeder, that the difference in perspective from a standard physics perspective should be a factor of 1 million times. Well, it means that if we look backwards and see 1 million years, if you were at the beginning trying to clock the same event in the future, it would be 1 year away. If we look backwards and see 1 million days, if you're at the beginning, the kind of Torah's camera, it would only be 1 day away. And you can repeat the experiment the other way around. You can say, if you look at the beginning of the Torah and you see an event is 1 day away, or 2 days, or 3 days, or 4 days, or 5 or 6 days, when we look backwards, we will see that as 5 million days, right? So if man is created in the middle of the 6th day, when we look backwards, that will be 5 and a bit million days. Now, what is 5 and a bit million days? It turns out to be 14 billion years. So it's an interesting correlation that if Schroeder is right, and that is the correct equation, when the Torah says there's 5 and a bit days, and then we look back and look at the same time, we see 14 billion days. You can actually test that 14 billion with 5, just multiply by a factor of 1 million, and you'll see that's correct. So he wrote a series of books as well. The most interesting is called The Science of Torah, I think. Or The Science of God, sorry, The Science of God. Science of God. Aviezer wrote a bunch of books called In the Beginning, Fossils of Faith, and probably others as well. They're all accessible. Okay, I'm not going to I want to sum up now where we are, because we're also more or less out of time. But essentially we discussed 4 different approaches. Approach number 1 is that God built a universe with a story to it. Okay. Approach number 2 is the kind of picture we've seen in the philosophy of the Kabbalah already going back several centuries, that in fact the days of creation and the Garden of Eden story are not inside space or time. They are a world, if you like, out of which our space-time emerges. Adam leaves the garden, the soul is divided across humanity, there's a central piece called Adam. This all takes place just before the revolution of lands in our world, just before the revolution of civilization, just under 6,000 years ago. Option number 3 is you can still map all the days of creation into our space-time. Just Yom is not a day, it's a cycle of time, and the Torah is not interested in how long it is. That science can tell us. It's interested in these cycles because they apparently have some lessons to teach us. And approach number 4 is they're literally 24 hours, just being measured from the beginning of the universe looking forward, and when we look back we see 14 billion years. So these are all possible approaches. You could even take either option 3 or 4 and option 2 and put them together, because it can be that the real literal reading of the Torah is the higher world, but there is some kind of mapping into our world. It's possible. But the most important lesson of all these things that I spoke about, and I apologize, the last one I'm a bit rushed, but the most important lesson is this. We don't have an ancient tradition on exactly how to line up science and Torah, because the rabbis then didn't have modern science. But we do have an ancient tradition of our approach. And that goes to Maimonides, the classical source, and others before and after him, that if God talks in different languages, descriptively talks with science, that is to say, he makes a universe intelligible enough and humans intelligent enough that by studying it we can unveil its secrets more and more and more, and we may get shocks to the system still, and we may invert all our understanding of physics one day by learning that it's all really to do with consciousness or who knows what, and we may get shocking results still. But in principle, we're unlayering the complexity of the universe and learning God's wisdom that way. And in the moral order, we can do that with Torah, but Torah is to a large degree revealed. Right? It's still an unfolding process, but it's primarily a revealed text, and therefore we are primarily the starting point of already how to act and all those sorts of things. That's already given quite early. And at any point they appear to conflict as Maimonides, it means you either haven't understood science well enough, or you haven't understood Torah well enough, or both. So you've got to go more deeply into the Torah and more deeply into the science, and you will see the harmonization. And I think we've seen enough to hopefully give us some models of how that can be. Okay? And on the contrary, on a deeper level, they're meant to be able to synergize, because what Torah is meant to do is help us get a sense of where we're meant to take science on its journey, what we're meant to do with revolutionary technologies we have, and also often when we look back, gain perhaps deeper insights into the text itself and what it actually, some of the secrets that it contained that we couldn't see without the scientific discoveries. So that's why I'm going to pause for today. And next week, hopefully, we have two big topics still to cover from our original. One is what the Garden of Eden story actually is, and two is the evidence of Torah being from Sinai. So we want to talk about both of those over the coming weeks. Okay.